And we're live.
Wonderful.
Okay. See, not too painful.
No, it's going well so far.
No, we're all right. All right. Now I'm good to go too. Once I get the better equipment, I won't have to jump back and forth to make it happen. Lorraine, thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you. I'm so honored to be able to come this week. So really my delight.
So could you just introduce yourself a little bit and what's your academic background?
Okay, for sure. So my name is Lorraine Smith Macdonald, or just Lorraine.
Lorraine?
My academic background is a bit interesting, actually. So I'm currently a doctoral candidate in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Calgary. And what that really means is that I'm working on my PhD and I've passed the preliminary exams. In terms of my previous background, I actually started training as a chaplain a long time ago. Yeah, so my original training is actually in chaplaincy. And I had actually intended to become a military chaplain. And so in a long, complicated story, I kind of accidentally, purposefully, as I call it, kind of stumbled into the military and veteran world. And so I started my training actually as a chaplain. I have a undergrad degree in philosophy and ethics, which most people would probably make fun of, but I have actually found to be extremely useful, particularly in my career. And then went and I did a Master's of Divinity, which is a 4-year program. I did it at St. Augustine, so at the Toronto School of Theology. And at that time, as I said, I was actually training with the intention of actually going into military chaplaincy. That in itself is a long story, so we can maybe pick up on that in a second. It didn't end up happening, again, for another long story, which we can also pick up on. And so I kind of wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. I had written a master's thesis, particularly on, at the time, moral injury and post-traumatic guilt. And I had done it because even though I hadn't become a chaplain, a lot of my classmates had gone into the reserve program. And I had a lot of connections at the time with the Canadian Armed Forces. And so this is probably around sort of 2000, starting in 2007 and going into 2010. And so there was obviously a lot of interest in terms of troop morale. Troops were deployed to Afghanistan. So there was kind of a Canadian consciousness, and then also kind of a consciousness in terms of the fact that, you know, with colleagues who had gone and done the reserve program and who were serving over the summers and then in their reserve units, I certainly heard a lot of discussions about some of the challenges that Padres were facing in terms of troops coming home and weren't doing well and trying to figure out what to do with that. So I wrote that thesis and was a little bit lost with my life. So I wanted to go back and do some more clinical training. And so I did a second MA in psychotherapy and became a certified counselor or a counseling therapist and sort of moved into the mental health world for a little while. And then I was offered the opportunity to come do a doctoral degree. Okay. And so when I was put in that position, they said, well, what do you think you want to, it's always the big question. What do you want to do? What would you like to research? And, I had sort of tentatively thought of a bunch of different ideas, but really I think on my heart was really the idea that I wanted to go back and continue research with this population and continue to do more work in that area, because I really felt like we were still struggling, that there was still more that we could do and greater understanding. And so
what's the pull for you towards the military in general? Because that seems to be the common theme.
Yeah.
There's a military core there. Why?
I think because I had a huge respect for it. My grandfathers had served in the wars, traditional kind of great grandfathers, great uncles, all those kind of things, the traditional. And I had actually always intended to go into the military, actually. So I think most girls usually have posters of, this dates me here, but the Backstreet Boys and those kind of things. And I had posters of, F-18s and guns, and I was a bit odd that way. I don't think my parents were like, we're not quite sure about this one.
So you were thinking Air Force back then?
Actually, I was thinking probably infantry, but I really like things that go fast. So, so I was like, ooh, maybe. Unfortunately, I got really bad eyes, so I knew.
Why were you thinking infantry as a lady? Because that's a tough go.
It is a super tough go.
I had, just to share with you, when I got to the 3rd Battalion, I never got to meet her, but the first one was there.
Okay.
And we just crossed paths.
Okay.
You know, don't know if I ever met her, but it was interesting. Even back then in '92, there was, and she had just finished her 3 years and got out. There was the feedback from, you know, from the guys, the actual what people were saying was really a split. They had some people that were, it's infantry man, not infantry woman, and you know, that sort of thing. But all in all, the majority, they were like, shut up. She did her job. She kept up. Shut up. And it was a defense of her. This is in '92.
Oh, wow.
And so when I read the biography of the lady that was the first infantry officer with the Van Deus, you know, and the horrible time she had, I said, well, that's because it was with the Van Deus. You know, maybe if it was with the Royals or the Patricias, it would have been an easier go. But would have been more respect there. But the struggle of anybody to make it through. There was 18 people on my battle school course, only 5 graduated. And that's kind of normal. You know, and it's usually bigger numbers. We were the scraps from holding platoon that went through. But you hear about started with 30, graduated with 10.
Absolutely.
You know, and the people that don't make it, sometimes they are permanently injured physically because it's tough training.
Yeah, absolutely.
So why infantry for you?
Okay,
why would you even consider that silliness?
Well, in hindsight, I probably wouldn't have made it, but what I really wanted to do was be on the ground. And I think I wanted to do peacekeeping. And so I wanted to go out and I wanted to serve. I wanted to serve my country, and I wanted to do the real stuff. I didn't want to be in an office. I didn't want to be the girl who's pushing the paper around. I wanted to do the job. It didn't. And so actually the intention for me was to go to RMC and to go and get my training and become, you know, but basically to do it with the intention of, you know, getting my boots on the ground shortly there afterwards. So it didn't end up happening for a variety of reasons. But that was what I had always wanted to do. And so when that didn't end up coming through, I actually was quite lost for quite some time and kind of wandered around and, you know, worked and did a whole bunch of ridiculous school programs that you do. I started in Celtic studies and my parents were like, really, what the hell is this? Both my parents were scientists as well. So they were like, is this like basket weaving? And I'm like, no. But I quickly realized there was no future in that. And so, you know, I had kind of given up on the military, to be totally honest. I kind of thought, well, it's not going to happen for me. And so I need to figure something else out. And so I ended up getting drawn to kind of a similar theme. I got drawn to ministry. Okay. So going into the church and doing Christian ministry. And so that's how I kind of ended up. So I switched programs and I did the necessary undergraduate degree to get into the graduate program, which is the MDiv. And so I had kind of, you know, it was really funny. I kind of given up. And then all of a sudden, totally unexpectedly, I needed a job, the usual story. I need a job. I need money. Those are handy. Those are handy. As a student, you need money. And so I was in the process of trying to figure out what I was going to do one summer. And through a colleague of my sister's said, oh, you know, the military always hires civilians or can hire civilians to do chaplaincy work with the cadets. Would your sister have any interest? And I was like, I have no idea. I don't know, but it paid well. And I said, why not? Why not? Sure. So I ended up at CFB Gagetown at Camp Argonaut in 2007. Okay. At the time the troops were deployed to Afghanistan, they actually were, they came home 3 weeks before my contract ended. And so suddenly here I found myself back in the military world, except with chaplaincy. So I was a padre, or as they called me, the madre, for the cadets. But because a lot of our young people had family that was either deployed or associated, you know, we had a lot of kind of either a parent was part of the troops or uncle was, you know, there was a lot of family connections. We ended up working quite closely with a lot of the Reg Force chaplains because there were a couple, unfortunately, casualties. Which was a whole new experience for me, kind of going through that. I had actually the son of a really good friend of mine. He was actually deployed. I can't remember which unit he was in. And so, you know, I remember the first time that we got notification that there had been a death overseas. And I remember just having this split moment going, oh my God, I totally hope it's not Tosh, you know, like, cause I don't want to have to call Stephen and say, your son is dead. Because I had said, if it's Tosh so-and-so, and I won't say the last name, please contact me. I know his father very well. I would want to do it. I don't want another chaplain to make that phone call. So it was a totally surreal experience. So long story short, here I am back in kind of the military world as a civilian cadet chaplain. So certainly not pretending by any stretch that I lived in the military world, other than I ate really bad food and didn't know how to put a uniform on. So I was constantly getting shouted at for getting my hands in the pockets. Stop putting your hands in your pockets.
Yeah, your Yankee gloves.
Yeah. So, but I really loved it. And so that's how, when I came home, I thought, no, I actually think this is where I belong. And so I had made that intention to finish my MDiv, go into chaplaincy, and applied the next year for the reserve program, got accepted. And then unfortunately, I just had some health conditions that didn't allow me to get through the full recruiting process. I was like literally going to get on the bus to go to the RESO training. And they're like, no, stop, you can't go.
Oh, man.
Your file's in Ottawa and we don't know what's happening. So I spent the summer, unfortunately, at home going, what's happening? And then eventually they just said no. So I think my file's probably still at someone's desk in Ottawa in between chaplaincy and
Is there
recruiting.
still a chance you might end up in the military?
I'm not really sure.
Does psychologists even trade within the military?
It is.
Okay.
So I think if I was to do that, I probably would go back and actually pick up my chaplaincy roots. So I didn't end up doing that. And then, as I said, long story short, I ended up back here and I realized actually at the heart of what I wanted to do was continue to serve this population. And so I realized, just because I can't go put on the uniform that way, it doesn't mean that I still can't serve. And so I really wanted to go back and pick up where I left off in some ways with my MDiv and the research that I was doing there.
So how you and I connected was through the OSI clinic. You have a poster on the wall there saying, hey, you want to be a guinea pig?
Yes.
And
Please.
I said, oink, oink, I'll be one. And we met and had an interview. Now, you've had how many interviews with veterans now?
I've had 20 interviews.
20 interviews.
Yes. So I'm so grateful. I loved your email. I got this email from Mark the first time and all it said is, I'm in. And I was like, this is brilliant. Like that, how more military can you get? Don't waste words. Just no hello. That just, I'm in. And I was so grateful when you did that and being able to talk.
Now, when you were sitting down with 20 interviews,
yes,
and God only knows some of the stories that you would have got, was it difficult for you to hear some of the stories? Did you have any surprises there?
I would say yes and no, and I don't want to sound like I'm kind of walking both sides of the line. I think because, I have worked in a chaplaincy capacity. I spent a couple of years working at a civilian hospital. And then I've also practiced as a therapist for the last 3.5, almost 4 years. And so, I've heard some pretty horrific things, right? And I can certainly remember those clients that stand out,
right,
even on a civilian side where you just think, oh, wow, I got to hold it together here. So I don't think I was as shocked as I think someone who's never had that experience. I can imagine if you've never heard something completely horrific before, I think it would floor you. But that being said, I think there were times, that even for myself, it wasn't in the sense of like shock and horror and whatever. I just remember feeling in a couple of the interviews when, guys would be sharing what they went through, just this profound sense of, it just broke my heart, for lack of a better word. Like I really felt the pain of it. And, there's one gentleman in particular, he was a little bit older, so he didn't quite qualify for the study, but he still wanted to really share with me some of his experiences. And I think he really wanted me to know how difficult his life was. And I've never said no. I've sometimes had to say, it might not quite fit with my study, but I always take it as data, right? Every story has something to add to what I'm trying to do. And, here's this, quite elderly gentleman, actually. And that was part of the reason, was because he kind of fits more the end of life kind of situation. And he's telling me in these very, very intimate details about his first deployment, which was to the Congo in 1953.
Oh.
And so,
all the African tours are always just the worst.
Oh, it's just, and I'm not going to kind of go into it because I don't want to trigger anyone here, but you can kind of fill in the blank. And it was I have to say that, and there was one other gentleman who actually was part of my study, who had worked in special forces and had gotten captured in Bosnia, and had been tortured, who shared a little bit with me about that. And I think those were probably the two worst in that sense, just because it was just so unbelievably horrific and evil what had to take place and what did take place to them. And as I said, it was just that sense of, like, I remember with the older gentleman who was telling me about his experience in the Congo, like, I generally have a lot to say. I'm a good listener. I'm a pretty good therapist, I think. I'm a pretty good chaplain, I always say, like, not so brilliant on the physical side, like, don't have a heart attack, but if you want to talk about your feelings, I'm really good with those. And I just remember being I couldn't say anything. I didn't even know what to say. And I remember I just said to him, like, I'm so sorry, and just gave him this huge hug, which I don't know if that crossed boundary lines or not, but I think what I wanted him to know was that I saw and felt his pain, and that he was not alone in that experience, and that someone else could, I think, hold that space for him.
One of the barriers that some of us put up, and I hear it at the OSI clinic, people that have dealt with it directly, and I've had to deal with it directly myself, is veterans being douchebags to each other and in different ways. I've had a couple of times, but one guy in particular, I was at a skydive center, and a guy that I kind of half recognized and said, hey, you served and blah, blah, blah. And I said something to the tune of, I'm a veteran too. He goes, no, you were in the Balkans. I was in Afghanistan. I'm a real veteran. Wow. And I went, how about that? All right.
Okay. Didn't know. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah.
It's interesting that anybody would do that. And, but we can be douches to each other. And the other dividing line is those that were deployed and those that were not. And I had that same dividing line for a while, because I was being the douchebag veteran. But there's something about just the training by itself, especially combat arms, that can leave a stamp on you that makes it difficult to function in the world as a result. Not sure where I was going with that.
That's okay.
Okay.
I can pick up on that. And,
sure.
And I think that was one of the things that really struck me was, when I came into my research, which was really, I tried to keep it as open as possible. So my research was really to listen to veterans and have them come up with their own model of the lived experience. So not medically oriented, but just to say, when you tell me about your experience of what it's meant to live with this operational stress injury or this PTSD or whatever the particular injury is, you tell me what the lived experience is like. And so when I came in, I think I was still very mental health focused. Obviously that was what I was kind of looking for. And what really struck me very, very early on in my interviews, I would say probably starting with interview number 1, was predominantly all of my participants spoke so much about that experience of being militarily processed. And so there was one gentleman in interview number 3, so again, very early, who said explicitly to me, my soul has been seared with being military. Like this isn't just kind of like a lifestyle. Like this has ultimately changed kind of who I am and the way that I respond.
I call it a stamp.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's no going back, not fully. It will always be a part of you. And would you say that a big part of that is because we're so damn young? Brain isn't even formed till you're 25. So those neural pathways are more or less set in stone during your formative years. Is that why it's just doesn't seem to be any going back?
I don't know explicitly, and I know there's a whole debate around this, but I definitely would say, I think the more we know about the brain, we definitely know that, yes, you're quite young, you're still making those formations. I think the other thing that we have to think about is the fact that we have spent probably 2,000, 5,000 since the first, caveman took a rock and smacked another guy with a rock. We've spent 5,000 years perfecting really the technique of creating soldiers. If you even look back at kind of the way that Rome did it. It was quite similar, right? We've mastered the ability to strip away kind of some of that consciousness and have really figured out how to kind of play in that space and how to make you do things. In some ways it's extraordinary that the programming is so strong that it almost breaks your internal will. And that's one of the things that I have put forward in my theory, is that there's a struggle there, right? Because when we think about something like moral injury, or we think about, a lot of my soldiers have shared that, they've done things that they haven't really wanted to do, but they did it anyways, whether that's because they had to, in the sense of having to get the mission completed. So mission over morals, or even at times just the fact that things were so quick, things were happening so fast that there really wasn't that time for conscious thought. And so their body just took over and did it. And in some ways, I can understand why we do that. That is important. If you had someone like me, I would probably spend, I get shot in 2 minutes, right? Because I'm a giant thinker, right? Like, I am the most useless person ever in a combat zone.
One of the mantras, especially in combat arms, is that hesitation kills. And that gets put into you. So you don't hesitate, you react, or you die, or the person next to you dies. Hesitation kills, but that F's you up for real life.
Absolutely.
Because hesitation is what you have to do so that you can ponder and contemplate and react or respond instead of react. But it goes against our wiring because hesitation kills. And if you have a problem, kill it. Doesn't work well in the rest of the world.
No, absolutely.
Doesn't work well. It was pointed out to me with one of the PTSD talks that I did online, that's on the channel, to not leave out first responders. And so I don't want to do that. I keep finding with because I'm so active in the veterans community, people are opening up to me with their experiences, and including first responders, police, paramedics, fire, and they always trivialize their own. It's like, well, compared to what you saw as a soldier, it was nothing. And those of us that were in the Balkans will say that about the Afghanistan. Well, Afghanistan must have been much worse than what we dealt with. And yet they hear the opposite, and we have a tendency to trivialize our own. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the different types of, and you don't have to be a soldier or first responder at all to be suffering from PTSD. What is the difference in presentation or the difference in treatment for, say, a military / first responder who's suffering from operational stress injuries compared to a civilian with PTSD? Or is it the same?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and there's a huge debate about this. If you want to, so just to put this in context, when so the DSM, so that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is pretty much the Bible of mental health, which has all the classified mental illnesses. So when we were switching from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, because it gets updated kind of every few years, and one of the big debates about the whole concept of PTSD in particular, well, there was a couple of debates. And this has been kind
Mm-hmm.
probably since the first time that a stress disorder got introduced into the DSM-1, which was shortly after Korea. It came out in DSM-2, got put back in quite strongly in the DSM-3, which was, of course, and that's the first time that you actually have the concept of PTSD. Interestingly, it lines up with shortly after Vietnam. So there's all kinds of discussion around that. And so in some ways, military health has led the charge, I think, in this, because it has been the most prominent, obviously seeing that come in the DSM-3, the push to have, particularly in the United States, Vietnam veterans suffering to be recognized, and to try and put some parameters around what is this thing that we're dealing with. And so if you look throughout the history, of course, we know that, even in the Iliad, they're talking about PTSD symptomology, though they are using different language. So long story short, when you looked at the DSM-4 to the DSM-5, one of the largest discussions was, is military PTSD different than civilian? And there's really two sides. So those people that say, yes, absolutely. And actually we need to be clear about kind of what types of PTSD we're talking about. There are those that would say, no, actually PTSD is PTSD. It doesn't really matter. I think one of the more interesting things that's come up most recently is that they're starting to show that when you go through a traumatic experience, one of the factors that seems to indicate whether or not you're going to have a struggle with it, in other words, it's going to be more challenging for people to process, accept, and overcome is whether or not that trauma is person to person or person to something else. So specifically what they're saying is whether or not that trauma can get internalized as being, this is about me being victimized. So whether or not we personalize it. And so traumas that happen sort of largely things like natural disasters, freak accidents, those types of events, as traumatic as they are, and we should not just, diminish the trauma that people do experience and those effects, mass flooding that we've seen, or even, the fires in Fort McMac. But it seems like there's a slight difference in those in the sense that people don't necessarily take them as personal. In other words, this is not a personal attack on me. However, if you go to the opposite extreme, we know traumas like particularly sexual traumas are profoundly problematic in terms of helping people overcome them, because not only do they physically are they a violation of someone's personhood, there is also often, because unfortunately a lot of sexual abuse we know comes from people that they know, very rarely is it a total stranger. It is this sense of, you purposefully chose me and did this to me. The betrayal. And so that piece I think is really interesting to think about. And I kind of think soldiers are kind of in the middle. And one of the things I proposed.
Well, with family, the sense of betrayal is stronger because the expectation of trust and safety is higher.
Absolutely.
And within the military community, especially the Army, and especially combat arms, and especially the infantry, the expectation of, you have my back, I have your back, is higher. So when that doesn't happen by your own people, the moral injury is greater because the expectation of trust is higher.
Absolutely. And it feels like you're doing this to me. And in some ways there's a legitimacy to, potentially a legitimacy to that. So I think when we think about soldiers, I think our soldiers or military personnel, I think the other challenge that they face is actually, I think, around this whole question of kind of moral injury and how we address their PTSD. And I call this very loosely, and I mean this in kind of the broadest sense, they're all also often both victim and victimizer at the same time. So what I mean by that is that obviously with the person who's been sexually abused, we kind of know in some ways kind of how to frame them, the narrative that we want the person to get to, or help them put themselves back together again. So obviously we want them to process out the trauma specifically. So that could be physiologically through somatic, it could be EMDR, PE, so that's prolonged exposure. So we want them to help them process out the trauma. And then we also want them to help create a narrative that fits for them around that shattered sense of selfhood. So I'm not a victim, or it wasn't, I don't need to be afraid for the rest of my life. I can be strong.
It didn't happen because of me. It happened to me.
It did, exactly. And so we're kind of clear. I think the struggle sometimes with, and this is even something that, sorry, I apologize.
No. I'm just making sure you don't get caught up.
Yeah. That's come out in my research is, I really feel for veterans because they can often be, as I said, both victim and victimizer at the same time. So, for example, the story of a gentleman who lost his friend in Afghanistan to an IED, clearly victim, right? Truly, truly victim. And the guilt that he feels there. On the opposite hand, in the process of that, then they also got ambushed. And so suddenly they're in this firefight and then he has to kill a couple of people. Suddenly victimizer in the sense that now he's confused. Because he feels like, well, was that the right thing to do? Was I supposed to do that? And so
there's no putting the bullet back in the gun.
Yeah. And so in this one moment, and it probably took, I think he said like 5 minutes. So in 5 minutes, his whole world has been completely shaken upside down, because not only do we have to address the trauma of losing his friend in such a violent and horrific way, and the guilt that he feels because he thought he had cleared the road of all of the IEDs. But then we also then have to process out that other experience of what was it like to then have to engage in a firefight and to then use that training that you were given. And as he said, I don't even remember it because I was so lost. Like it was just autopilot. I just did it. I just engaged. That's what I do. And so this is not in any way to like, I do not think soldiers are these horrible, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying there's a weird dialectic that I think soldiers have to wrestle with. And I have such compassion because we know it's difficult enough to sort out one narrative and get people to process the trauma one way, but to then have to work in this space where sometimes you're working both ways, I think is really complicated. And I think that's, for me, that moral injury piece that we need to do better with.
It never seems to be the event. It always seems to be what that event means to me.
Absolutely.
You know, it's not the problem, it's the implication of the problem. As a, for instance, some of the horrors that that were witnessed in the Balkans by most of us, it wasn't the charred corpse or whatever that horrendous scene was, so much as what it meant that one person could do this to another person.
Absolutely.
You know, and there's the there's the odd movie that actually hits it right. I'm like, oh, they had got a good writer there. They must have actually talked to people that were there. There's a line out of the movie Fury, where the new guy gets in and he's like, holy shit, and there's bombs and bullets and nobody else even notices. You don't even spill a coffee, and he says, yeah, you'll get used to that soon enough. But what you don't get used to is the realization of what one person can do to another person, and also when you have to, what you can do to another person.
Absolutely.
Not only will you see the devil, you will see the devil inside yourself, and that is something that there was also a line with a Clint Eastwood movie, and he's like, it's not the ones that I killed, that I had to kill, that bother me. It's the ones that I killed and I didn't have to. You know, if a person gets to that point in that environment, which does happen to a lot of folks. Absolutely. You know, that's well beyond the coulda, shoulda, wouldas. Yeah. It's I know I didn't have to. Yeah. But I did anyway. And having to sit with that. Yeah. Have you run into that?
I definitely have. And I think in some ways that was a predominant theme throughout my research when I spoke with veterans. What really struck me was that I think we do such a good job getting soldiers ready for, and I really mean this, for the physical demands of combat. You know, the training that we put them through is just unbelievable. By the way, I also realized I'm hugely not resilient. I wouldn't, as much as I would love to say, oh, I would have done so well in the infantry, I would have spent 5 minutes and died, you know? So it just, and I mean that quite honestly, like huge respect, just unbelievable respect for the physical training that we put our soldiers through, in some ways, the mental toughness we create, the resiliency. I honestly, I am in just such profound awe of some of the things that people have done or have had to do, just, you know, physiologically, just, you know, in terms of, you know, hiking all night, you got this pack and then you got to go combat and you haven't slept and still holding it together. Like that is great. Like, ask my husband, if I don't sleep well, it's not a good day for anybody, you know? Yeah. So
the hallucinations kick in around 36 hours without sleep.
Good to know. Good to know.
If you ever want to know what it's like to have some kick-ass hallucinations, stay away for about 36 hours and then they start to kick in.
Awesome.
Especially if you couple that with extreme physical labor.
Okay. I'll take your word for it.
It's true.
Okay. And so we do such a good job. So getting back to the point, we do such a good job in terms of getting soldiers ready. And I think the training we do try and give you, I think is in some ways the best. We have honed it really well. But I think the part that we are still falling down on profoundly is this side. And you know, people could say, well, you can never completely get ready for everything you're going to see. And yes, that might be true. But my goodness, we need to at least try. We need to at least help you have that conversation. And more specifically, if we can't get you prepped on the front end completely, then we certainly better have those supports in the back end, either during deployment or post-deployment or even post-civilian, you know, moving out of the military, because you know, those are some of the biggest challenges. And I think the parts that my participants wanted to share the most with me were those stories. You know, one gentleman put it really bluntly. He said, you know, PTSD for me is being mad and sad And we had struggled a little bit in the interview up to that point. We were struggling to connect. And I think he was a bit frustrated with me, to be totally honest. And then I just said to him, so I put down my stuff and I just said, tell me what you're mad and sad about. And then all of a sudden, you know, it was like this huge change in the room, and he got really quiet and he got a bit teary. And all of a sudden it was just, he just wanted to tell me these stories.
Getting mentally combat ready for his own. When I did my tour, there were people that were on their second and third already in the Balkans. And it's no different, as I reflect, than kids teaching each other sex ed, you know, learning from a Playboy or something like that. And then learning from your older cousin or whoever and telling you about the birds and the bees. And it was like that. There was no official structure for preparing you for what you're about to see. We were on QRF, which is Quick Reaction Force, for pretty much the whole tour, which is, so you're always ready to go the whole damn time. But we were on call. Our QRF was on call for body recovery for about 2 weeks. So for 2 weeks, we're like, well, come on, if we got to do this horrible thing, let's do this horrible thing. Because some village was taken out and we've got to take all these bodies from A to B. And I know lots of people that did it. And a lot of the people that were there on their second and third tour, they start telling you what that's like because they've done it. And but there was nothing official on what to expect or what would be required of you. Just like kids learning sex ed from each other instead of from like some sort of process for trying to understand something that cannot be understood.
Yes.
You know, like, you take Vicks Vapor Rub and you put it on your top lip or in your nose for the smell. And the smell is apparently so bad that you have to burn your uniform after. So, you know, so you kind of got to prepare for that. You keep one in a Ziploc bag and, you know, ready. And then after you're all done, because the stink doesn't come off. Things like that. You just learn it from each other before you even go. And there's just nothing that gives you some sort of baseline to prepare, you know, until you're in it. And you're like, oh, okay, now we're in it. And it was like that for the tour. They try to give you but we were new to the Balkans then. And we'd been a peacetime army for so long that there just was no way to formally get you prepared. You know, not really. We trained our asses off prior to the deployment, but nothing that would prepare you for actually being in a combat zone.
Absolutely.
From what you've seen, is there any mental health preparations now before people go over to help them adjust to that environment better?
I definitely know that mental health has been more integrated in terms of trying to get people ready. I know that here in Canada, the Royal Canadian Chaplaincy Service is also taking up that call and is trying to get people more, I guess, you know, spiritually, however you come to understand that for yourself, more spiritually ready. Because I think at the heart of a lot of what you end up seeing in combat, I think it challenges or questions, you know, the base of our humanity, you know, those kind of deep spiritual existential questions, you know, even if you're, you know, non-religious or don't necessarily believe in God. I think, as you said, you know, at the heart of it, it's this question of how could one human do this to another human, and what does that mean? So I do think there is beginnings of that, and I think people are trying to get that together. I certainly know, if you've ever heard Romeo Dallaire speak, I've had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of times, and that is his big call, that, you know, we need to have, you know, a center and we need to have preparation as much as, you know, we go and do physical fitness. We need to almost have spiritual fitness. And the US has certainly picked that up in their 5 stars of readiness. Spiritual fitness is one of those. And really a big part of that is just having people think about how are you going to make sense of this for yourself? You know, what beliefs do you already carry in to this? You know, what's your world orienting system? How are you going to manage some of this? But I think we also need to be better for the back end as well, because I do think, again, we can think about it all we want. And I'm extremely humbled because I've never been there. And so I know I can never, I mean, I'm speaking from from a civilian perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we need to do better on the back end. And what I can say is that I think in general, we do struggle with holding that space sometimes for people to work through those questions and helping people to work those questions, right? Those are fundamental questions. And they can't be ignored, and we can't push them under the rug, and they're not secondary to other experiences. I think what the literature is starting to show is that those unresolved issues, whether it's anger, whether it's bitterness, whether it's resentment, whether it's guilt, whether it's shame, if those feelings are left unresolved, then we know that that is linked to linked to an increase in duration, intensity, and severity of mental illness symptomology.
And of course, the ultimate consequence, suicide. Lots and lots of it.
Absolutely. For me, at the heart of suicide, I think is, and I've had to even see this in some of my participants, which again, when you asked me, was I shocked? I was surprised by how open people were about either the number of times they tried to commit suicide or their struggles with suicide, and how, again, for me, how heartbreaking that is, because at the heart, for me personally, this is just my personal opinion, is hopelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And what have we as a society and as a community and as a military, what have we done that we've left you in a space where you think there's no hope?
Hopeless and pointless. One of the challenges, especially if you've been in a combat zone, there's nothing more intense.
Mm-hmm.
You hear of guys doing high risk activities, the fast motorcycles, skydiving, 24 jumps, trying to recreate that intensity, and you can't. Nothing that you can do. Skydiving gets fairly close. It's such a crazy environment. It's a wonderful thing, but nothing ever puts you back onto that edge again. And that makes it feel pointless, just life in general, because you'll just never, I guess that's why people get addicted to heroin. They call it chasing the dragon. Yeah. Well, we chase the adrenaline dragon. And there's this hollowness, this emptiness after, and the sense of purpose, because when you are a part of something that's big and there's thousands of other soldiers that are there, and it's a giant operation with the multi-million-dollar equipment and everything, it just feels like you're a part of something huge and purposeful. Yes. Whether it's right or wrong, who cares? It's purposeful, that it's big and it matters. And then you never, ever find that again in your life. That creates a hollowness. So I every now and then get somebody tapping me on the shoulder and asking me questions about PTSD, what is it, and other veterans in particular. And there's a couple of first responders in my mind that I think I'm fine, I'm good, but I can see through it. PTSD and OSIs create a blind spot. Would you agree that our self-awareness, that the problem is ours, that the world isn't a bunch of assholes, it's actually I'm the asshole? Do you find that that's a blind spot?
I think so. I think that's I would say in fairness, I think that's a general struggle. Yeah. That, it's everyone, we'd all love it to be everyone else's problem. But I think, I do think, I think the more mentally well you are, the harder it is to see that for yourself. I think I often wonder if that's because you're working so hard to just survive and just hold it together, that the mere inclination that it's you is just too much. And so you almost can't accept it, that it's you, because
we got a hell of a habit of destroying marriages. We're really good at that. Shock and awe. What are some of the red flags that we might be able to see in our own lives that have us go, oh, maybe there's an operational link there, and maybe I should go to just talk to somebody. Right. What are some of the flags that maybe we can see?
I think relationships are probably the first place that you can start to see the flags. I think you need to look around you And well, first of all, look at what relationships are still in your life. So even looking at, do you have any relationships in your life? If they are, who are they with? Did you lose anyone? And if you did, who were they? And were they important to you previously? I think as hard as it is, and I can absolutely totally appreciate this, especially as I said, when you're struggling, when it feels like you're drowning. But listening to what is the general theme of what everyone's telling me. There is, my interview number 3, shared very much similar experience, was really on a downhill slide. And it was this really old, mean, crusty guy that he was working for, who he was like, wow, this guy's mean. Yeah. And one day, after losing his mind at, I think he was a trainee, the trainee had done something wrong. It was in a mechanic shop. And as he said, in the military, screaming at your underling for 15 minutes is totally acceptable. In the civilian world, not so much. Not so much. So he kind of lost his mind on this poor young trainee because he didn't put the wheel on properly. I don't remember the details. Not important. The point is, the reason he shared it with me is he thought it was fine. He thought it was like, this is totally normal. And then this really old, crusty boss of his came out to him and said, wow, dude, you got to tone it down. And he said that moment of having somebody that I thought, wow, kind of pot kettle kind of moment, like having someone that I was like, whoa, what's your problem? Come to me and say, dude, you got to tone it down a little bit. Like, you're a little bit vicious. Was, as he said, it wasn't the complete turning point, but it was a little bit like, whoa, that's kind of what everyone else is telling me. You got to tone it down. So I think looking at your relationships, so looking at which ones do you have? First, do you have any?
Are you isolating yourself?
Do you have any? With whom do you have those relationships? Did you lose any relationships? What is important? And kind of what is the tone of people, in general? And I know it can be hard. So that last point might be a little challenging in terms of picking up on, but in general, what are people saying? Because I think especially for soldiers, one of the things that I have learned from my participants is that physical pain, physical uncomfortableness,
that's okay.
That's totally fine. You guys are all good,
Yeah.
Like he's like, I was sleeping in my car. I was totally fine. Everyone else was like freaking out. And he's like, it's covered. It's warm. I'm not on the ground.
I was on a quad trip with a bunch of realtors years ago. And they all got like, their fifth wheels and motor home and everything else. And I had the back of my truck with a cot and a tarp. And I thought I was like pretty good. I'm high, I'm dry, and a storm was coming in, and everybody's like, Mark, you're not really. I'm like, dude, this is actually pretty Gucci. Like, this is the Soldier's Hilton here.
Exactly.
And they were just like, oh my God. They're like, I don't know, just like, I'm fine.
So I think the relationships is important. I think also picking up on kind of some of those spiritual things, that we talked about. I think asking yourself, am I hollow? Am I empty? Do I feel hopeless? Have I lost a sense of meaning and purpose?
Are those depression symptoms as well? And the relationship between depression and PTSD, it seems like you can't really have one without the other.
I think you can. Well, statistically, you can. You can't have one over the other. Soldier populations, it seems like there is a lot more comorbidity between PTSD and depression. I also think there's, again, that overlap with sort of, I think of PTSD, depression, and moral injury, right? So, are you angry too?
Are you angry? The moral injury, when we originally met and we did an interview, I talked about our tour, Roto 4 on the Croatian side was famous among our little circle for moral injury because of the leadership. How we were treated by our own leaders was unbelievable. And we get around the campfire to this day, and the anger. Matter of fact, I just made a post on Facebook on one of our pages and mentioned a name or two. And the feedback's like, oh God, I thought I was finally good. And then you had to bring up that name, and now I'm just wrecked for the next week. Like, oh my God, I'm so mad. And there's something about that moral injury that just doesn't go away. What do you have to say about the impact of moral injuries? Like, and how do you use that to spot it in yourself, like, oh, this is actually something I need to work through?
Well, so moral injury in terms of a topic is relatively new from a psychological perspective. I would say it's come up in the last probably 10 years in terms of being an accepted concept. I would say before that, I think it just kind of got plopped into sort of spirituality and religion. I think if we look historically, that's kind of where we would see it. It's very interesting when you look at some of the Aboriginal First Nations tribes that would do purification rituals for their warriors coming home. With the idea of sort of, at that time, casting out the demons before they were allowed to come back to the tribe. So there's some really interesting things that kind of come up historically, but not to get sidetracked too much on that. In terms of recognizing it for yourself, without copying out, I mean, I think it's different for everyone because each of their experiences is going to be different. My rule of thumb for myself as a clinician when I'm working is the things that bother me 24 hours. So I really follow a Buddhist rule, which is that you have 24 hours to either let something out or it'll become stuck within you. And so I really followed that rule as a clinician and as a person. So I have 24 hours. Let's say the guy cuts me off, on traffic this morning. I'm raging. I have 24 hours to do something with that rage, or it gets stuck, according to a Buddhist rule. And I tend to follow that for myself. So I think about it in terms of I need to either get rid of this, I need to let it go, I need to vent it out and be like, oh my gosh, you won't believe what happened to me, which then is usually followed with what I'm trying to work on for myself, which is forgiveness practices, saying, okay, this happened, but I can forgive you, not in the sense that I can say what you did was okay, it was dangerous, it was stupid, but I'm not going to hold on to that anger. I'm going to let it go. I'm going to let it go for myself.
I've had a few people reaching out to me about they're just barely hanging on, and because they haven't put down this and they haven't put down that, and the bitterness and the hanging on to the negativity, which brings me to something I wanted to talk to you about and ask you about, was the portion of recovery and coping that is mindset. So as far as coping and recovery, can you talk a little bit about mindset and what it should be and the importance of it?
Well, I think in terms of mindset, we definitely know that it influences so much. And we know that there's the possibility for what we call post-traumatic growth, right? Like there is a way that is possible to heal and to grow from this experience. It's not necessarily the death sentence in some ways that people see it as. And I think this is a struggle across mental health, right? The first time a client is formally diagnosed with whatever it is, it can absolutely feel like a life sentence, but it doesn't have to be. And I think healing can happen. And I think there is something so amazing. And I have seen this, in my own life and in my clinical work. And I've seen it in my research, moments of what I call grace, moments of just healing that come. And so I think mindset is really, really important. And I think part of that is having the mindset of what is it that you ultimately believe? Do you believe that this is going to be the end? Do you believe that you will forever be stuck here? Do you believe that there is no hope, that you are nothing is ever going to get better? It's going to just be as it is. And I think part of that mindset really is helped by and comes from living witnesses. Because I think when it's so dark, when you're so lost and you don't see it, you need somebody else to come show you the light. And this is why I'm such a big believer in peer mentorship and having support, because you need somebody when it's really, really dark and it's hard and you're barely holding on. You need that person to come who is the light and be the living testament, the visible witness of there is hope. And so having that mindset, I think, also comes from seeing, because we're tangible creatures. We need to see that somebody else like me has found a way through, has managed to come out the other side. And
and that's the strength of the peer support groups.
Absolutely.
Every other Tuesday, we're in a peer support group. Mine was yesterday. Tuesdays are always an ass kicker because I'm in therapy at 9 a.m. for an hour. And then the peer support group starts at 11. And I'm just been thrown through a wood chipper by the time I've gone through both of them. But it's so important. In your studies, have you really looked at the effects of peer support groups and the effectiveness of them? Has that been a topic?
I've sort of accidentally stumbled. I haven't really, in the sense of it's not my area of specialization, but I've kind of accidentally stumbled into it because that peer support has come up so strongly in all of my interviews, and the importance of that. And as I said, what's really come out of that is that sense of, we need visible, tangible hope.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think going back to that mindset, I think, in some ways we become what we think. And so
yes,
if you're constantly focused on the negative, and I know this in my own life, right? Like I kind of feel like I should, do confession, that, I have my own struggles, in my own life in terms of that. But the more you think about that, in a silly way, for example, being part of academia, it's long, it's a 5-year program to get through your PhD. It's hard work. There are some days where it's a real struggle. And the more you think about those struggles, or the more you get together. And yes, I actually think venting and lamenting is quite helpful. But at some point too, if that's all you're kind of doing, then all you think about is, oh my gosh, this is so hard. I don't know how I'm going to do this. Versus having a colleague say, okay, it's hard, but I'm going to pick you up on Sunday morning and we're going to go and we're going to get 4 hours of writing done.
Do you have any favorite books on mindset that...
No, if you have any that you recommend, I'm always looking to learn. I mean, not that I can specifically think of. If I think of anything, I'll probably think about it in the car.
In our peer support group, one of the ones that keeps coming up that I read years ago that I just love is The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz.
Okay.
So The 4 Agreements, it's a Toltec wisdom. It's just so baseline and simple, and easy to connect to and to relate to. So The 4 Agreements with Don Miguel Ruiz is a good one. And people actually tell me that my book, that's right there, Why Not Me, available on Amazon.com. That it is, I'm a firm believer that one of the reasons I was able to survive and function periodically at a decent level was because I wrote that book. And in hindsight, I'm like, oh my God, it was my own PTSD survival guide. I just didn't realize it at the time. There's and something I'd like you to share and straighten me out if I'm wrong. But I believe that there is 2 lines for recovery. There's coping and then there's healing.
Yes.
And they intermingle and they blend. But there's, I think it's helpful to, when you're looking at an activity for dealing with it, with dealing with OSIs and PTSD, that you identify, am I coping or am I healing? Yes. Now, coping, I believe, makes room for healing, but if all your focus is only on the coping mechanisms and you're not actually healing, it's going to be a slow boat. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think there is a difference between, coping and healing. I mean, other people have put it like surviving versus thriving. There's a variety of terms that are often kind of bantered out. As I said, there's even, clinically this whole idea of, post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress versus post-traumatic growth. So I think we are sort of moving into that space of sort of recognizing that there are those 2 things. And the way I think about it is I think coping they are intermingled, right? They're not straight lines. They're not parallel. No. They intersect into each other. And, some days just coping might be the best thing that you can do. And that's great. Hang on to that. But the way I think about it is coping is sort of, how do you manage those? It's sort of like managing those conditions. How are you managing the symptomology, for lack of a better word? So, how are you managing those triggering moments? How are you managing today's a bad day, I'm super anxious, or today I'm struggling, I have a lot of negative thoughts, or today I'm feeling very low, or I'm feeling very hopeless. So for me, coping is kind of like dealing with the symptoms, and that's extremely powerful. And as I said, some days coping is like, just ticking the box with coping is like amazing, and you should be extremely proud of yourself, right?
There's so many armchair psychologists because I am involved with so many of the veteran Facebook groups, so I see these conversations that I shake my damned head. Well, just go for a walk in the woods. Would you fuck off. What works for one person might not work for another.
Yes.
And what works for one person in one moment might not work for you in another moment.
Yes.
Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think this is why, there's so many coping techniques, right? There's so many, and those are good, right? Because you need that variety, because what works for one person isn't necessarily going to work for the other. I mean, we have certain things that, we can talk about in terms of, managing thoughts or managing physiological symptomology or those kind of things. So there's lots of things, but I think part of that healing is understanding, and this is where I think that deep work comes in, that deep work.
Mm-hmm.
How did you become wounded? What is at the core of that woundedness for yourself? And that's where that healing takes place, is when you're able to identify, again, just making this up, so bear with me here, but, my woundedness came from just the complete shock or the complete lack of ability to make sense of the horror of humanity. If that, you know what I'm trying to say, that's a much deeper wound, right? And so for me, then the challenge is, how are we going to help you heal that wound? And I think, for that wound specifically, when it's about broken relation, when we look around and we say, I can no longer do relationships because I'm so disappointed. I'm so angry with people, right? They've failed me so utterly that I'm struggling so much. Then the hard work, the healing work, then is, how do we help you reestablish relationships? How can you be healed by other people's love for that woundedness? Because ultimately that's the only thing we can do, right? We can let in, and I think part of that is that it's holding that space and not rushing people, but holding that space to have that lament, to have that grief, to have that pain acknowledged, but then working on a way to find out, how can we begin to heal that woundedness? So each of that woundedness might be completely different for all of us. But
one of the surprises in my own journey is that through therapy and everything else, is that it's not the event, it's what that event meant to you because of your entire life prior to that event. Because you are not what event. That is not what makes us. We are a mosaic of everything from birth to now. And we are all of that. So if you have a particularly upsetting story from childhood, then you go into the military, there are force amplifiers and compounding effects that, so that if you have two people, and I said this in one of the videos that I did, how we can be douchey to each other. And I've just seen it again and again. There's a couple of people that had a good tour on our tour, and they said, well, what the hell is your problem? He's like, dude, you're in the back of the storeroom. Like, really? Of course you had a good go. And then there's others of us that did not have a good tour. But even if you were a fire team partner and you're side by each, and you go through the exact same event, and the event affects the one person, but not so much on the other person, it's because you're different people. So what happened prior to that event, it creates your filter. Yeah. And that's how you, am I on track here?
No,
Top my ear?
No, for sure. I mean, who we are is hugely experienced, right? I mean, I have three sisters, so I always look at my sisters and think, wow, how are we related? But even though, I mean, some of the core of who we are probably is very similar, and that's absolutely influenced by, how we grew up, our parents,
and really just wired differently.
But then, that's expressed very, very differently. How we each experience certain things in our life and certain traumas were very different depending on everything from, our personality to the age to, and so on. So absolutely. And I think that's the challenge, is that it can be a struggle to necessarily identify what those core aspects are, because they're going to be different. And that's why it takes, I think, time, and it takes that hard work, and it takes that therapeutic relationship to be able to, not just with counselor or a therapist or whoever it is, but, with other people, because identifying what is that is for you is challenging. And I think it's the scariest work. It's the scariest work that we have to do in all of our lives, is looking at sometimes those deep wounded experiences and ask ourselves, as you said, what was it about this experience for me that was so profoundly hurtful?
What do you have to say about some of the people that put up walls? I tried to get to this one earlier and then I got sidetracked. A fellow at the OSI clinic that said, well, I'm airborne and you were just infantry, so you can't understand me. And you have that same sort of, you can't understand me because you didn't do what I did sort of mentality. And I've heard that about, my therapist doesn't actually understand. And how important is it, or like, what do you say to these people? Like, from my perspective, I try to explain to them, like, they don't have to understand what it's like. They only have to understand what that it has an impact, and that it has, like, how would you delineate that? Or how would you deal with that? Or what do you say to these people?
I think it does matter. I mean, I do think having people who can understand our experience the most is very powerful, right? And that's why I do support that peer relationship, right? Because having someone who can understand intimately, whether it's because you're a veteran or you're a survivor of sexual abuse or whatever it is extremely powerful. But I don't think, and I have seen, I have experienced that for sure, when people say, well, you don't know what my experience is like. And I'll say, absolutely, I don't completely. I can't, right? Like, I'm never going to be able to be 100% in your skin, right? Like, there's always going to be a limitation by the fact. But what I can do is I can do two things, hopefully effectively, as a therapist. One, I can show you that I care by listening as well as I can and being as open as I can be. In other words, I'm going to keep asking, I also often say to clients, part of the reason I ask you a lot of questions is because I really want to understand more, right? And so this isn't me, trying to be difficult. This is me saying, help me get closer to this experience for you, right? And I might not be able to completely get over the bridge and, we're on the same side, but I can get pretty darn close. And the second thing that I can say for myself is I'm going to work as hard as you are to tap into everything that I have to give you. So I can tap into all of my feelings. I can tap into my sense of anger. I can tap into my sense of injustice. I can tap into my sense of disappointment and pain. And
regardless of the experience of the veteran, what I would like them to understand is that there's different modalities of therapy, and your therapist can be a guide through that modality. You can't take yourself through the modality, which is a process, but you can, regardless of what the trauma is, and you can go through ART or whatever it is, and you guide them through that modality and put them through that process. That does help, and it takes the foot off the gas pedal. What I try to explain to guys is that, no, you're not going to get fixed, but it's going to take the foot off the gas.
Yes.
It's going to go from unbearable to tolerable. And then it's going to go from tolerable to much more tolerable. It scales. It's always going to be there. Yeah. I believe. But it's just, will you be able to function in life without this being, the dark cloud would just be a little less dark.
For sure.
It's just more manageable and livable.
And I think you bring up an interesting point too, that different modalities of trauma therapy are going to require different things, right? So obviously, if you're doing a more kind of traditional talk or narrative therapy, then there's going to be a lot of, that kind of lots of talking, lots of deep questions, those kind of things. But if you're doing something like prolonged exposure or art, it's going to be a different type of relationship because it's more of a process that you're working through. So the relationship really depends on kind of where you're going. But I think it's one of those and to sort of summarize your question in terms of, what do you say to people who say, well, you don't understand my experience? I would say first, absolutely, I don't, right? I can't say as a civilian woman,
but to treat me, you don't have to.
But I was going to say, so absolutely, but to treat you, I don't have to completely. What I have to do is be clinically competent. And I think more importantly, or I shouldn't say more importantly, actually being clinically competent is pretty much the key, but I would say equally importantly, I would say my job is to be there and show up and show that I can care, right? That you are more to me than just patient number, whatever, right? Like that I care about you and that I am here to do the work with you.
Yeah.
To support you in that and to offer you, the most that I can offer you, which is my clinical expertise.
Has there been any big surprises working with veterans? Any holy shit moments?
For me, the biggest surprise probably was realizing how supportive and warm they are once you get past the initial, like when I first started and I came to Calgary, I'm originally from Ontario. So in my first year here, I spent a lot of time trying to just, meet people and work with organizations and just kind of, you do a lot of the shaking the hands, kissing the babies kind of, but I was really trying to get involved, especially with a lot of local veteran groups and say, this is who I am and this is what I really want to do. And I really, I'm here because I want veterans' voices to be included in the clinical and academic literature. I'm not here to just, toot my own horn. I really, really want to listen to what veterans have to say. And, of course, I show up as me and veterans take one look at me and usually there was a lot of giggles and laughing, and I was told just, go screw myself in a variety of fun and interesting ways. Yeah. And, it was a little bit humbling at the beginning for sure. And I have to be totally honest. Honestly, when I started the project, I started recruiting and I had no one for quite some time. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, this is going to be an interesting PhD because I have like no one. But then, through those connections and I think constantly showing up and saying, I care, I want to do this. I genuinely want to help. I'm not promising that I'm going to fix the world. I'm not going to fix Veterans Affairs. I'm not going to fix your OSI, but I want to help. I want to try and do my part. It was amazing for me. And the biggest surprise was just how all of a sudden, I think when I showed up and showed that I cared, just how committed those guys were to come out.
One of the purposes of this podcast, and as we spoke about before, it's not the PTSD podcast. Mm-hmm. It's all kinds of different topics from real estate to whatever. But for the veterans components and in the title lines, it's always going to be obvious that it's a PTSD talk. It's the idea of having a force amplifier for peer support. And it's not a therapy replacement, but I'm thinking this might work as a peer support augment for when people are home and alone and they need a little connection time to explore themselves, that they can come to the podcast, pick the episode and go through it. When you watch the first couple ones that I did the 11 causes of PTSD, which I pulled right out of my ass. It's just based on my own observations of what I've seen and my own journey. Was I off in left field on any of those 11?
No, I don't. I think so. And I have to say, I'm gonna bracket this by saying, my experience is more limited. I'm relatively new. A lot of this I'm basing off the conversations that I have had. So, I'm not a therapist who's worked 45 years in the field. So let me just caveat that. But I would say no. Actually, we had talked about those 11 causes previously about a year ago. And then when I, reheard that podcast, and especially because I am sort of getting to the point in my own research that's, I'm putting my own theory together, or it's not my theory. I guess it would be your theory. I'm putting the theory that veterans have proposed in terms of what that lived experience is about. And I would say for me, no. I think part of it is that those 11 causes, I think we have to be clear in the sense of from what veterans have shared with me is that they're not causes in the sense of like A plus B. So I had this and therefore I got PTSD.
Causes / contributors.
I almost see them more like events. I call them events that open the door. And I think really what they do is that those events, when they're unresolved, when you go through an event, particularly a traumatic event, and it's unresolved for you, or more especially when it begins to eat away at or disrupt or dysregulate or cause discongruence between especially who you thought you were, what you were doing, why you were doing it, and what the reality is, that's very problematic, right? Because we're kind of, humans are creatures, we like conformity, we like, we like certainty. And so the way I think about it is it kind of starts to open the space for this wave, this oscillation to start happening. And the more and more that intensifies, particularly if you start to have more experiences that are unresolved, or the intensity of that unresolution gets bigger and bigger and bigger, then at some point it feels like there's a tipping point. And then for a lot of my participants, that's when they said, that's where those formal diagnoses started to come in. So it's not necessarily, as I said, that it's like A plus B equals, it's not like traumatic event, therefore you're going to get PTSD. But I think what's so curious is that for me is that it opened the door for those. And I often wonder from my personal perspective, if that's because, as I said, it really starts to build this discongruence in self and self-unity. And one of the most interesting things that's come out of sociological and psychological theory around self, and this is a very contentious topic, so you could have lots of discussions about this, but this whole concept of whether or not we have a true self is very hot at the moment. But the reason I bring this up is that one of the biggest theories that is starting to move and starting to gain a lot of sort of empirical data is that when we lose our morals, that seems like the biggest reason that people would say that their self has changed. So a lot of this work is actually coming out of issues with like Alzheimer's and dementia, right? And so when people would say, well, I've lost my husband because he's no longer who he was.
Right.
So when researchers go and ask those spouses and say, well, what is it about it? Is because he doesn't have his memories? Yes, that seems to be problematic, but not hugely. Is it because he doesn't have his traditional personality traits, right? Like he used to be friendly and smiley and happy, and now he's grumpy and whatever. And they would say, no, not really. And what they discovered when they kept pushing and pushing and pushing, people would say, well, he's not the good man that he used to be. He's doing things that he never would have done before.
Right.
And so I find that so interesting, looking from the veteran perspective, because I think if that's true, if the way that we define who we are at the core of who we are is this person, particularly this good person, and when we disrupt that, and I think anyone who's had a traumatic event, that gets fundamentally disrupted.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't resolve that. I wonder if, and again, this is literally a hypothesis. I wonder if that's not the seed or the seed of what begins to start to unravel for people and who they are. And subsequently their mental and their physical and their mental, their emotional, their physical and their spiritual health starts to struggle as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you think about that, but there you go.
Well, it's like we were speaking in my simplistic way of looking at it. It's a stamp that is left on you after you have seen the devil. Mm-hmm. Whether that's figurative or literal, it's irrelevant. It's the same. Once you've seen it in others, in the world, and in yourself, that is something that that leaves a hell of a stamp and has consequences that have to be managed and dealt with and overcome, mm-hmm. at least to some degree.
Yeah.
But Lorraine, I think we're there.
I think so.
Thank you so much for doing this. I can see that we would probably have a few more. Would you be able to do this again?
Absolutely. If people are interested, presuming you don't get like a million comments saying, oh God, not the redhead again, please. I would be delighted. Thank you so much, Mark.
Oh, thank you. And this is going to help people. And so we'll be sharing it for anybody that's watching. Make sure you share this on or for anybody that that is served and may be struggling. First responders as well, police, paramedics, etc. But thank you for tuning in, and Lorraine, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Alrighty.
Okay. All the best.
Alrighty. Now I have to physically go over here to